Hey friends, welcome back. Last week we saw something that absolutely infuriated Screwtape. The patient began drifting back toward the father through simple pleasures like a walk, a good book, a sincere prayer, and real joy, and all of it began unraveling Wormwood's previous work. Now, in letter 14, Screwtape launches a counterattack. And what makes this letter so fascinating is that he is able to twist one of the greatest Christian virtues, humility. Or more specifically, he wants the patient to become proud of being humble. Let's get into it. One of the things Lewis captures brilliantly in this letter is how quickly we can turn spiritual growth into self-focus. The patient begins growing, he begins recognizing God's work in his life, he's becoming more sincere, more grateful, more dependent upon the Father. Screwtape is all too familiar with this behavior and immediately goes back to his playbook. Get the patient looking in the mirror, he says, not literally, spiritually. The moment the patient notices growth, get him thinking about himself, how much he's changed, how mature he's become, how much better he's doing than before, because once the spotlight shifts from God back to self, the temptation has already begun. And that's what makes this trap so perilous. The patient may still be growing, still praying, still serving, still attending church, but now instead of admiring God's work, he's admiring himself. Screwtape's strategy here is almost comical. In fact, Lewis writes it with a sense of humor because of how absurd it becomes. The patient becomes humble, then notices he's humble, then becomes proud of being humble, then notices he's proud, then becomes proud of noticing his pride, then proud of noticing his pride about his humility, and around he goes. It's almost funny, until we realize we've all done it. We've all had moments where we felt good about doing the right thing, good about resisting temptation, good about being disciplined, or good about being spiritual, and before long, what started as gratitude quietly became self-congratulation. This is exactly what Screwtape wants. He doesn't care whether the patient is proud of his wealth, proud of his intelligence, or proud of his humility, as long as the attention remains on self. Screwtape completely understands humility. He understands it perfectly and works to ensure that the patient doesn't. He says, don't let the patient think of humility as a kind of self-forgetfulness, but as a low opinion of his own talent and character. He aims to use self-contempt as a diving board into all sorts of contempt, such as gloom, cynicism, and cruelty. He references pretty women trying to convince themselves that they are ugly, and clever men trying to convince themselves that they are fools. But Lewis highlights that none of those things are humility at all. Screwtape simply wants the patient focused on himself, constantly, whether positively or negatively, because either way the patient remains self-absorbed. And this is where Lewis introduces a highly profound observation. He says that God intends to bring the patient to a place where he can recognize a virtue in himself without becoming proud of it. Imagine someone complimenting you on your generosity. A proud person might think, yes, I am pretty generous. A falsely humble person might think, no, I'm really not. In effect, both responses are still focused on self. The truly humble person simply sees the truth. If he's been generous, he acknowledges it. If he's grown, he acknowledges it. If God has changed him, he acknowledges it, but then his attention moves on. Because humility isn't pretending reality doesn't exist. It's seeing reality clearly. Lewis even suggests that a truly humble person might one day recognize his own humility and simply think, by Jove, I am being humble, and then immediately become interested in something else. I love that image, because it reveals what humility actually is. Not self-hatred, not self-obsession, not false modesty, just freedom from constantly thinking about yourself. And that's exactly what Screwtape fears, because once the patient stops staring into the mirror, he can finally start looking toward God. The most important distinction in this letter is that Screwtape wants the patient to become self-conscious, and God wants the patient to become God-conscious. We need to recognize the difference. A self-conscious person constantly evaluates himself. How am I doing? How do I look? What do others think of me? Am I succeeding? Am I failing? But a God-conscious person asks different questions. How can I serve? How can I love? What does God desire? Who needs encouragement? Who needs help? One mindset turns inward, and the other turns outward. Lewis is showing us that humility grows naturally when our attention moves away from ourselves and toward God and others. One of the most beautiful ideas in this letter is that truly humble people rarely think about humility at all. They're simply engaged with God, engaged with people, engaged with life. They're not constantly measuring their spiritual progress. They're too busy living faithfully. And this is why humility brings freedom. Pride is exhausting. Pride constantly asks, how do I compare? Am I succeeding? Am I getting recognition? What do people think of me? Am I doing better than I used to? But humility sets us free from that endless evaluation, because we are no longer the center of the story. God is. And the less time we spend staring at ourselves, the more clearly we begin seeing him. This shouldn't surprise us. Pride is the oldest temptation in existence. Before there was a serpent in the garden, before Adam and Eve reached for the forbidden fruit, there was Satan's rebellion, a desire to elevate self, to place self at the center, to look away from God and toward his own greatness. That's what makes pride so dangerous. Most sins pull us away from God by tempting us with something else. Pride pulls us away from God by tempting us with ourselves. That's why Screwtape is so invested in this strategy, because if he can keep the patient focused on himself, even his virtues, he's reproducing the very pattern that caused Satan to fall from his heavenly estate. And that's why true humility is so powerful. Humility breaks the cycle. It redirects our attention away from ourselves and back toward God. And that freedom is one of Screwtape's biggest pet peeves. Letter 14 brings another incredibly deep message. The enemy doesn't care whether we think poorly of ourselves or highly of ourselves. If he can keep us thinking about ourselves, he's already winning. Because pride isn't simply believing you're better than everyone else. Pride is making yourself the center of attention. And humility isn't merely lowering yourself on the throne. It's stepping off the throne entirely. It's recognizing that life isn't ultimately about us. It's about God, his glory, his kingdom, his purposes. And strangely enough, that's where real freedom is found. Not in obsessing over ourselves, but in forgetting ourselves altogether. In this letter, Lewis reminds us that one of the enemy's most sophisticated attacks isn't making us proud of our accomplishments. It's making us proud of our virtues, especially our humility. So let's be careful not to confuse self-awareness with humility. Let's not mistake talking about spiritual growth for actual spiritual growth. And let's remember that true humility isn't thinking less of ourselves. It's thinking of ourselves less. Next week, we'll continue into letter 15, where Screwtape begins shifting the patient's focus away from today and eternity with the uncertainties of tomorrow. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next Friday.